Hey, if you would, give your name and when you were born and where you were born, please.
Well, I don't know anything.
I've heard that, yes, but go ahead, please.
Okay, my name is Scott Trostel, and I was born in Miami County, Piqua, Ohio, on September 7th of 1952.
Very good.
That means I'm an old fart.
Join the crowd. Uh, okay. Do most of your life and all this, what occupation, what did you really center in? I know you've had a variety of occupations, but what was your main one?
Um, my main occupation was sales and marketing at Hobart Brothers Company in Troy,
Right.
which has since been sold to another company and no longer exists. And of course, I have had an art studio since I was about 1972 at my parents' home. I took over one bay of the garage and converted it into an art studio. And then I did oils and acrylics, and I got into watercolors after I got married.
Okay. When did you first really get into the railroad aspect of it, all this, the interest in?
Well, that's an interesting story. My dad bought me an American Flyer train set at the age of 2, and that was totally fascinating. And when I was 5, he bought me an HO scale train set and a board to mount it on. And I had never heard of mounting a train set on a board, so I could drag it out and flop it on the living room floor and run trains all day. And then I started visiting all of the model railroad layouts in Dayton. And that's what I always wanted, was one of these big basement wall-to-wall layouts.
Sure.
But I couldn't convince anybody of that. And since my parents' basement wasn't completely dug out yet, well, we did an enlarged version of the board in the basement.
Okay. When did you first become acquainted with Mr. Keller and the Allen County Museum?
Well, the Allen County Museum came up first about 1966. There was an article in the Dayton newspaper that there was going to be a permanent railroad exhibit in Lima. And of course, I can just barely remember steam engines on the railroad. So by the time you're 14 years old, you're dreaming that you can see one of these one day. And of course, it gave all the story about it. It was the last engine built at Lima Locomotive Works. And I didn't even know that that place existed, or that Lima, Ohio was the home of it. And so we were coming up to Wells Department Store, and this was about 6 weeks after the exhibit was installed at Lincoln Park. And I said to my dad, do you suppose we can find out where this here nickel plate engine, this Berkshire, would happen to be? So we pulled into a filling station and asked the guy, and of course he came down to the square and went out Elm Street, and there it was. The rails weren't even rusted over, so I knew it had just been put in there.
Right.
And of course I wrote to the Allen County Museum, figured that they had some part in it. And the answer came back from a man named John H. Keller, who became a lifelong friend. I would originally correspond with him as an anxious 14-year-old, and he would always write back. He was generally on his run to Frankfort, Indiana,
Right.
and he would write a note and stick it in an envelope marked Norfolk and Western, and I would get it, and it'd just be a brief few lines. I'm on train number so-and-so, and I'd come up to Lima anytime and see the train. So of course I did. I got more for my money than I thought. There was a caboose behind the Berkshire and a passenger car, which was later told to be a business car. And I had no idea what this stuff was. So I started reading books at the local library. And the more I read, the more I wanted to know that I didn't know. There was no book on Lima. There was nothing on Lima Locomotive Works. So finally, we had a model railroad club in Piqua. And I said, hey guys, what about we go up to Lima to Lincoln Park on a Sunday and we could have a picnic and I'll ask Mr. Keller if he can open the cage.
Right.
Well, John Keller said, yeah, I'll open the cage for you. This is 1967. And so we came up and we had our picnic. John Sr. and Charlotte were there, and several people from our club. And John Keller unlocked the cage and we got to go through the whole exhibit. This was a treat of a lifetime.
I'll bet. I know you also at times have kind of helped out Mr. Kellenholm and John Baldwin and some of the other stuff going out there.
Oh,
What all
yeah.
did you do?
Yeah. When I got my driver's license in, let's see, 1969, it was the fall of 69 when I got it, and there was two places I wanted to go. One was Cy Herring in Bellefontaine, over to see him. We had communicated and he knew John Keller, and the other one was to come up here so I could take the time to explore Lincoln Park like I wanted. And John says, oh, well, me and John Baldwin are going to be working at the exhibit all day. You can come up and help us. So I was a gopher.
Hmm.
I drove my 1960 Pontiac Catalina, which was a wide car. It was just beyond belief. You know, here I was driving. I had to make a promise to my mom that I wouldn't drive any more than 55 miles an hour on County Road 25A.
Okay.
And she was the one that finally gave me permission to come up to Lima. So I spent the day helping John, and he had his work clothes on, his bib overalls that he wore on the railroad, and John Baldwin was in his work clothes. John did all the high stuff on the scaffold, and John Sr., he was more on the ground. And we did such things as wipe the dust off the engine. Of course, it's called wiping down. And touched up some paint. We looked through the car, the caboose, and explained the different nuances in the caboose, and then in the business car. And I couldn't call it a passenger car after that.
Right.
It was a business car. And he explained everything to me so that I could understand it.
Could you say a little bit more just about John Baldwin for those that don't know too much about him? I know he was an influential character out there at the park.
Well, John Baldwin was a retired state of Ohio man, I think with the Ohio Department of Resources and Oil and Mineral Rights. And he was kind of a gopher, or a handyman. I don't want to say gopher, a handyman. He knew how to weld, he knew structural engineering. He had this wealth of knowledge that you could only get from working in this field, and that's where he got his knowledge. So I could always count on if John Sr. was going to be working at Lincoln Park, John Baldwin would show up. And so he was an acquaintance. I thought very highly of him.
Okay.
In fact, I helped him drill the oil well out the Allen County Fairgrounds
Okay. I
back
heard
in
about that.
1976.
Right.
I called up and I wanted to give him some information about old standing oil well equipment that I had seen out in Illinois. He already had all the equipment bought.
Okay.
And so he of course put it to use, and we had that tamper, I call it, piece of pipe that went down and banged on the limestone a little deeper, and when he pulled it up, it had about 10-foot length or so, and he dumped the limestone out and go back down and pound some more and get it and pull it back up. And so we did that one day, and that was a big experience for me.
What are your thoughts or your memories and all this of the early Allen County Museum when you first came here, and the changes that have occurred since then and all this time?
The Allen County Museum building wasn't very big, and of course I'm 14 years old. The first time I came here was to buy the Nickel Plate Road, a publication written by John Rehor.
Okay.
And I bought it for $8.50, tax included.
Goodbye.
And I got a letter from John Keller a week later saying they made a mistake at the desk. It was supposed to be $16.50. And could you send us up a money order or a check? So of course I had my paper route money, and by this time I'm going through the nickel plate store. There was nothing like it before.
Sure.
And so my first experience was coming in the door, the main building, the front door. There was no such thing as side doors at that time, or back doors.
Right.
And I seen Dick Cook's books.
Right.
And so I bought both of them, which he signed complimentary to the museum. And I've got both of them in my library today. And I thought, well, this is a handy place, but like all the museums around here, they just didn't have anything about the railroads. Well, then of course I was coming up to see John Keller, and he would come in the back door, which would be along here, and come downstairs. And there was a tunnel that connected the steam house, which is now gone.
Right.
And in that tunnel were biller's plates and everything you wanted to think of for the railroad industry. And John had taken the time to remove the biller's plates from all the nickel plate engines out at South Lima. I think if he could have carried a bell, he would have.
Probably.
And so I just marveled at it. And a friend of mine, it turns out he was my neighbor growing up. He came up here to see John Keller one day, and John says, can I offer you one of these biller's plates? And so he brought it home and he restored it and mounted it. When he died, it was willed to me, so I've got one of the biller's plates from the tunnel. Well, I was starting to see the inside of the railroad industry and collecting a little bit. Of course, I'm 17, 18 years old at the time. I was too intrigued by automobiles and watching trains and a few girls.
A few, yeah.
Yeah, so it just didn't occur to me to collect anything like that, and I'm glad I got the one I did.
Okay. Now, did this, I mean, when you were with Mr. Keller at times and over the years, did you meet, besides Dick Cook and some other, was there any other personnel that was in the rail industry, book writers or otherwise, that you met in that time frame?
Well, I met Dick Hoover, who's the general manager of Conrail through here, and Dick became good friends with me. He would call up when he was stationed in Indianapolis, and he'd say, I'm going to high rail the B line from Bellefontaine to Indianapolis. Would you like to come along? And let's see.
Did you ever meet Reed Prue?
No, we corresponded, but I never met Reed. I had an interest in interurban railways that most people didn't have, And of course, this was John Keller's main focus when he was younger.
Right.
And so my great uncle, he would come down to my house and he would sit and talk about the trolleys that he rode on the way down to Dayton and back every day, because he worked at Frigidaire at their old plant in basically down by Barney and Smith's shop. And he rode the Dayton covering the Piqua down and the Dayton and Troy back to Piqua and took the city lines home. And so I could talk to John in a small way about the interurbans. And that sparked an interest, which has obviously ended up with 6 books on the Western Ohio Railway when I got to looking around.
Could you explain a little bit more about Barney and Smith, the company?
Well, Barney and Smith were big car builders. They were a threat to Mr. Pullman up at Pullman in Chicago. They built very early sleeping cars. They built railroad cars before there was a railroad track at Dayton. And they would have to ship the cars out on the canal over in Indiana. They would take them up to Toledo and down the Wabash and Erie Canal, or down the Miami Erie Canal to Cincinnati, or north, or wherever it may be. So they became the largest employer in Dayton. Eliam Barney was a school teacher, and he wasn't very successful. So he bought a sawmill, and that's when he started building railroad cars.
Okay.
And of course, the plant grew from 1 building to 2 buildings to 4 buildings to 76 total buildings on the northeast side of Dayton. And Barney and Smith was known worldwide for the quality of their cars. They owned their own timberlands down in Georgia. And South America, they had South American mahogany railroad cars. And of course, let's see, the hard pine and up around here, oak. They buy anybody's oak trees. If you could saw them down, they'd haul them off.
Okay.
And old Mr. Barney, he wanted to employ 100 people. Well, I have not found the records of the company that speak to the employment, but it was over 1,000 people. And they were dominant force until about 1899. And several small car builders decided that they needed to compete against Barney and Smith. So they merged. American Car and Foundry, Pullman took a couple of other, Hollingsworth and so on. And they became Barney and Smith's competition overnight. Now, Diamond Jim Brady can be associated with the whole thing and the railroad cars. Diamond Jim was out of Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is where the steel rail car was invented. And the other producers quickly changed to steel manufacturing. And Barney says, no, we're not going to build steel cars. They're just cold and they just don't have any appeal. We're going to stick with wood cars. Until one day they woke up and found out there were no orders for them anymore.
Right.
So they went out of business in the 1920s. Mr. Smith was related to James McDonald here in Lima.
Oh, okay.
So there was a direct link. And some of the city cars used to here in Lima came from Barney and Smith. The original cars were from Pullman, but later cars came from Barney and Smith.
Now, if my memory is serving me correctly, and all this, Reed Prue and all this was a surgeon down in the Dayton area? Or?
Yeah, Reed was a surgeon at Miami Valley Hospital, and he had an extreme interest in interurbans.
Right. Was the Ohio Electric, I think, was the main, one of the main ones that he focused on, wasn't it?
Yeah, and he was wanting every detail and every scrap that you could find on the predecessors, Ohio Electric, Dayton and Western, on and on and on. Dayton, Springfield, Urbana, Bell Fountain and Northern, Lyman, Toledo Traction. Well, he got acquainted with John Keller, and he would periodically take a day off and drive up here from Lima, and he would be sitting with John Keller's notes in the kitchen up off the auditorium, and he's smoking like crazy, and he's drinking coffee and always taking notes.
Okay.
And so I was acquainted with him through John Keller, and we only corresponded.
Okay.
I never met the man in person, and he died just a few years into our correspondence.
Okay. When did you first get the itch and all to write railroad books and such? And what was your first, out of curiosity?
My first book was Bradford, the Railroad Town, which was 10 miles west of Piqua on the Pennsylvania Railroad. And after I got my driver's license, I heard that they had put out a book, a history book, and I thought that'll be loaded with railroad pictures, probably 2 pages. And so when the railroad men would come by, I'd run up the railroad yard and pick their brains. All the stories were different, but they were all true. So I said, by the time I'm a freshman in high school, I'm going to write a book about Bradford. It took 22 years to complete the first edition.
Okay.
And so I decided, well, maybe this writing business isn't too bad, because I had problems finding a publisher and became a publisher myself because of all my background in marketing knowledge. And I decided I could get them printed up in Michigan fairly cheap.
Right.
Could sell them for $17.95 hardbound.
Okay. Now it's Cam Tech, correct?
Yeah, Camtech is short for Camera Technical Publishing,
Oh.
because I was doing service manuals for the camera producers, the Nikons and the Canons and the Minoltas and all of those, and they were fairly successful. So I figured, well, if I can do that, and I can work at Hobart Brothers, and I can put out a 60-page catalog, I can probably do a book. Okay. And we had to get galley type made from the new typesetting machines. And so I would go order a galley type from the local producer, and then I would have to cut it all, and it was waxed on the backside, and that's how I attached it to the blue sheets, which is what they shoot to make a film for the printing presses. And so now you've had a history and how you make books. The rest of the story of how I got into the writing books. I get a letter from a man named Eldon Neff wrote me a letter thanking me for a book I had given him. And he mentions that he was friends with John Keller. And so I thought, well, I've been encouraged here a little bit. Maybe I'll take on the topic of the Summit Hill down in southern Ohio and do a softcover book. Eldon wanted me to write a DT&I history, and there had been 4 attempts and 4 failures from other authors.
Right.
And so Cy Herring encouraged me to write that book.
Who was Cy Herring?
Cy Herring was a New York Central man from Bell Fountain, Ohio. He met John on a train out of Muncie that got put onto the T&O St. Mary's for some reason and came into Lima on the B&O. It was a nickel plate train. So at any rate, uh, these two guys are saying, let's go for it. So Eldon brought me over all of his records and his photos. And I sat down and I thought, well, we can do probably a 50, 60 page soft cover book and we can sell it for $8. And so I went ahead, talked to a local printer, because hardcovers are one thing, doing a soft cover, there are a lot of places that can do it and you want to control the quality.
Sure.
So I found everything that I needed. We printed them in Troy, bound them in Troy with staples, and I offered them for sale. And it was like a landslide. 1,000 copies didn't even satisfy the market down the Summit Hill area is very hilly section down in southern Ohio. A lot of curves, a unique railroad. When it hit the Chillicothe newspapers, I had tons of mail from Chillicothe wanting a copy of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I still get them today.
Oh, after all these years.
So the arrangements with the Michigan printer who would have to print this book was I would pay them in advance for the production of the book. I figured 2,500 copies. I went through 2,500 copies in 6 weeks. And I went back for a second printing. And so I was off to writing. It was just after that I did the Henry Ford book, from all the excess information on the DT&I Railroad under Henry Ford's auspices. And so I just went ahead and did that book. That one is done well. I've sold several thousand of them. And I decided, well, we're going to settle back here and do a little more writing, a little less camera work. And then my eyesight left me for about 18 months.
Right.
So I installed talk and type into my computer. I could talk to it and it could type it out. My wife could proofread it. And then the computer could read correspondence in the mail for the most part. And obviously it did for the most part.
Right.
Got a few wrong and a few couldn't read. But we went ahead and did that, and I wrote while I had the temporary loss of sight. And my first trip back up here, not to the museum, but out to Cargill, was to get their engine ready, which I had purchased for a grain elevator in West Liberty. And so from about 5 in the morning till 7 in the morning, it was real hard seeing the headlights. But I drove up 25A, I got up to Cargill, and the sun by that time was up, and my vision had been totally restored.
Beautiful.
And I was able to do the setup work on the engine,
Okay.
which came from the Sacramento Northern Railway.
Okay. Now, if I recall right again, too, and all, one of the museum's friends and all this, it is somewhat forgotten. Russ Heine assisted you somewhat with your books, didn't he?
Yeah, Russ, he called me one day, I knew him anyway. He was being critical of some of the punctuation on an earlier book. I forget which one it was. And I said, well, Russ, if you don't like it, you can do something about it. You want to be my editor?
Okay.
And he said, sure.
How long did he do that?
He did the DT&I book and the Henry Ford book. And then I had the vision loss, and so there was nothing going on for about 18 months. So we managed to talk on the telephone, but that was about it. There was no running around seeing trains or writing books.
Okay. Do you remember, or when was your first speaking engagement here at the museum?
With my first book.
Okay, that early.
Yeah, that would have been 1987,
Okay.
and Ray Shuck was the curator in charge,
Okay.
or administrator in charge.
Yeah.
Forgive me, Ray.
Yeah. Yeah. He was curator and all this before they changed titles and such.
Yeah, whatever it is, you can edit that out.
Okay. About how many speaking engagements here at the museum do you figure you've done over the years?
Oh, probably 7 or 8.
And about how many overall speaking engagements? That may be a big number to count in all the
Oh,
various places.
thousands,
Okay.
thousands. You know, I have spoken at 60 colleges. There are all the ladies' church groups, and they just aren't around, Fletcher. It's Dayton and Richmond, Indiana, and of course up here to Lima, I've talked to a couple, and on over towards Columbus, and then the Civil War groups, and the Lincoln societies, which have taken me to Washington, D.C. and Indianapolis. Uh, I have a professional background, of course, in welding, and I even spoke on welding and how I have spoken professionally in Louisville and Pittsburgh and Indianapolis, and let's see.
I know you mentioned earlier and all about, of course, the History Channel and the various networks. Could you give me an idea of some of the topics you spoke on in these particular
Yeah,
areas?
well, the History Channel, I was included in the program Stealing Lincoln's Body because I was identified as the national historian and writer of the Lincoln Funeral Train book, and of course its counterpart, the Lincoln Inaugural Train. And so that was my debut to mainstream media.
Mhm.
But when Lincoln died, and of course I had all this correspondence, several Lincoln people knew about me, and I got a call to come out to Springfield, Illinois. And actually I had my choice of 5 different filming sites, and I said Springfield. So I went out there and was on set at the Museum of Funeral Customs as they were filming segments in the movie.
Right.
And so I know my hotel was a block from Lincoln home site.
Oh, okay.
At 6 o'clock in the morning, I got up one morning and I want to see the streets of old Springfield, where the national park has cordoned off all the homes. And I walked through all of the, along all of the home sites. And then I later took a tour with a group from a curator from the Lincoln Home Site National Historic Park. And I think I told him maybe a little bit he didn't know.
Okay.
Those people today do not do original research. I don't have a lot to say.
Now, is research something you really have enjoyed doing over the years, really delving into stuff?
Yeah, I have enjoyed it. You know, when I started, I was 14 years old, writing the Bradford book as a freshman in high school, and I would go up to the Piqua Library, and all the newspapers were up in the attic. If you wanted to see them, there was no such thing as microfilm. You went up there with the front desk clerk, and she turned on a 60-watt light bulb over a card table, and you folded these books out page after page, and I was going through them looking for the very early trolley stuff. And of course, that spun into microfilms, and at one point I carried 20 library cards. I'm down to 2 now.
Oh, yeah, well, that's kind of downsizing, yes.
Well, the wallet just got too thick for me to carry. Some people got a lot of money,
That's the VA.
but I carry library cards.
Okay.
So I was going to the Dayton Library. I go over to Ohio State to their library archives and Wright State University Library. Let's see, I've spoken out here at Rhodes State, but I haven't done any research out there. All the good stuff's right here.
There you go.
And so, of course, I brought up the canteen books.
Right.
You know, all the records of those canteens are in various places, and nobody even thought about them. A few weeks back, I was down in Dayton, and somebody came up and started talking about my book, and I said, "Where are you from?" They said, "Bell Fountain."
Okay.
And of course, I'd done one about, the first book I did was on the Columbus Avenue Miracle.
Right.
And the second book I decided to do Lima. And let's see, I did, but I didn't publish one on Springfield. And my main book was Angels at the Station, which was about 25 of them. And people didn't remember that a service like this existed along the railroad track for the men. And here, the second largest in the United States was right here in Lima. So I thought, you know, this has got to change. We got to have recognition of the events. You know, buildings and streets, they just don't mean much, but the events mean a whole lot.
Correct.
And I had a goodly number of people around when I started the Lima book that could give me their first-hand experiences. And the same way with Bell Fountain. We found enough of the girls, by this time they were old ladies. I shouldn't speak, I'm an old timer, 68.
Right.
And I could get their stories of what happened and why. And this is what makes history so important. It's not the number of rivets in the seam of a railroad car.
Right.
It's not the whistle by itself. It's the people behind it all.
Right. Now, out of all your books, is there anyone that's really special or dear to your heart?
My next book.
There you go. That'll work. Sort of a different little tact in all this. You, of course, obviously have had a variety of jobs and all this, and I'm kind of a little interested in when you were making builder's plates and number plates and such. What was the process for that, and when did you start?
Well, I'm a hobbyist woodworker. You know, I built all the furniture in my house, and I built the house. And I was looking on eBay, and these prices for reproductions were terrible, and the quality was terrible. So I said, you know, I know somebody that runs a pattern shop at a local foundry. I'll go in and visit with him. He showed me how to do it. I went home and I did it. I built a Lima builder's plate pattern because that's what I wanted, a Lima builder's plate. And then I had to learn to melt the metal, so I built me a forge to learn to melt metal. I melted pop cans and anything that was aluminum scrap. I paid $1 a pound for it. And you're running 1400 degrees when the aluminum melts. And they said, you gotta watch the amount of moisture in your sand, and they showed me how to test it, and I did. And so I got into making builder's plates, and at my height I had 23 of them. And I got one for the Union Pacific big boy that's out running around. And I've been asked by a few museums to reproduce a plate for an engine that they have some significance in their railroad history.
Now, is this sort of similar to what Lima Locomotive Works did with their little forms and such to make various parts and such and all this with the sand? And,
Yeah, they and Ohio Steel.
Okay.
Now, neither of them got into making the advanced patterns needed for integral forming of this frames and the cylinders and all of that. You know, the Allegheny frames and cylinders were all cast out in Philadelphia.
Explain the Allegheny to people that don't know.
The Allegheny was the largest locomotive that Lima built. It was built during World War II. It was a simple, meaning it steamed all four cylinders at the same time of the 2-6-6-6 wheel arrangement. It had an extraordinarily large firebox, and it pulled all the coal over the Allegheny Mountains. I have stood on the main lines where that engine once ran. I've seen the last one when it was on the scrap line in Russell, Kentucky. And I've heard the different stories. It's amazing that they could even get them built at Lima.
This sort of leads us to another area in all this that the museum is very, very proud of in all this. Your work on the vestibule of the city streetcar. Could you give us an idea as to what condition it was when you first saw it and the process of restoring it cosmetically? And
well, car body number 60 had been scrapped in 1939 when they gave up the ghost on Lima Street Railways. And it went out here east of town and was used as a tool shed. It was, I say visually okay, but shaky at best. And it was offered to the museum, so they went out and looked at it. And one end of it was still in the barn. That was all they could save of it, was a 5-foot section that was inside the barn because it hadn't been subjected to all the elements. And so they took it to the storage quonsets out on the west side of town, and it sat there until, well, let's see, 2009?
something like that.
Yeah, then you called me one day and said, are you interested in doing a restoration to it? Well, it sounded like a fun project, and I could rent my neighbor's barn. It had electricity, and I could go to work right over there. So I could be looking in the window of my house at my office if there was anything going on, and over in the barn. And gosh, we came up here to get it ready twice. I brought up some tubs and took all the parts and components, and I figured out what they were eventually as we got into the resource. And then Bob Torbett, he brought the actual front end of the car down in a trailer, and the first thing he says to me is, I couldn't go over 35 miles an hour. I was afraid it was going to fall apart on me.
Okay.
It was in that bad a shape. So we got it off of his trailer, and we put it in the barn, and I stabilized it as best I could. And I ended up stripping it down completely and taking all the sheet metal off and scraping the paint off. And that's how we found the different colors that was on it. The car had apparently been used up in New York before it came down here.
Right.
And so I spent the better part of 6 or 7 months doing a restoration. I had to redo the floor. I had to do a back wall for it. Not to be critical of the other painting of the interior of the trolley that was in the museum, but it was disconnected. And so I just decided, well, I'm going to call the museum and ask for the controller and the air brake, and we're going to put them in this car so that people can see where they went and what they did. And then when I get it up to Lima, I'll come up here and I'll paint a mural of the inside of the car.
Right.
So I came up about 3 days a week for 6 weeks, and I painted it all in acrylic. Now, I didn't advertise this. I got a whole lot of my family worked up in that painting.
Okay.
My grandfather's driving the beer wagon, and 2 of my grandsons are holding hands as they walk down the street. 2 of the other grandkids are on the other side of the street walking past a beer joint.
Of course.
And
Well, somebody else is in there too, isn't he? You know, this week we can't mention names.
yeah, Charles, you're in there. You're waving your money from the street up to a window.
There's a nice, friendly woman up there in that window, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Who shall remain nameless.
Yeah, I don't think we knew her name. Now, of course, you did research then, I'm assuming, too, of course, on the various businesses here in town that you're advertising in there.
Yeah, I used the city directory, and then I painted what would be advertising circulars up in the clear-story roof. And I'm going to take a drink.
The streetcar and such and all, talking about that.
Oh,
in the research.
streetcars.
Our vestibule here down here, the one downstairs.
Yeah.
You mentioned research, of course, up there and all that for the various ads and such, and of course the various family members, among others. Where did you get your painting skills, or was that just something natural?
That was natural. I had a studio when I graduated high school. I put it in one bay of my dad's garage. I was living home yet. And I just felt like I had to paint, and I don't know why. I just sat down and bought me a beginner set of oil paint. Didn't use any of those paint by numbers boards that they sell you. I just started sketching and putting a little paint here and there until I got it to look right. And I've done about 500 or so paintings since then. And probably my best one that I like is hanging in my bedroom hallway, and it's 24 by 36, and I painted it in 1973, and it's a C&O Hudson running in the snow in Indiana.
Okay.
So I paint oils and acrylics, and I added watercolors in later years.
You were speaking a little bit earlier and all that, so this is the one time and all about the book you're working on Lima. Could you talk about that a little bit more, please?
Oh, well, yeah. The title to the book is The Railroad Era in Lima. In all of my years of being around John Keller and all of my correspondence and all of the trade associated publications, I discovered a whole lot about Lima that I didn't know and hadn't been given to me. For instance, there was a roundhouse at Main Street on the Pennsylvania Railroad.
Okay.
They built cars, trolley cars up here at the Grand Avenue car barns.
Right.
The Lima Defiance Railway was both steam and electric. There were major car shops, which the skeletal remains of a few buildings were still existent when I first started coming up here, and they just tore down a few years ago. They employed 1,000 people and burned to the ground one time, and they rebuilt them. The same way with the shops in the Nickel Plate, Lake Erie and Western. They burned to the ground too. And they rebuilt those shops. And of course there was a roundhouse there. And Ohio Car Company and the Lima Locomotive Works, when they moved to South Lima, there was a fire. And of course the caboose work went back over to Lafayette, Indiana, and Lima Locomotive took over the whole property down there. But I didn't know any of this. And I would always ask, what does OS stand for in the tower where the DT&I and Erie Railroads crossed? It was Ohio Southern Junction. And The Ohio Southern brought the coal up from southern Ohio to go to Chicago and Milwaukee, but they didn't go any further than Lima. They gave it to the Area Railroad to take on up. And so the original DT&I Ohio Southern station was on Main Street, and the area had a roundhouse on the east side of Main Street. I didn't know any of this stuff.
Sure. Talk a little bit more about John Keller and all kind of. I mean, I know, of course, meeting him and such and all this. Give people and all that didn't have a chance to meet him a little better idea as to the man's knowledge and what the man was like.
Well, you know, he had a very likable personality, and he was straightforward. You didn't get any stored answers from him. He just told you how it was, and that was it. And his philosophy was, I am here to serve. And I have been at the railroad station with him, waiting on another passenger. And I can remember this, this was down at the Erie station. It was on a Saturday night. The train was late. Her ride from the station was late. And John says, let me take you home. His truck was down there, so he went over to the nickel plate yard and got his truck. And he loaded up her suitcase and he took her home. He didn't ask for anything. I've seen him express himself in that way more than once. I remember another Saturday night in the summer, there was a black boy who was crippled, and he was crossing on the crosswalk in front of me. I was sitting at the traffic light, and John says, man, you gotta feel sorry for him. He's got 2 strikes against him. And he did. And John just clasped his hands as in prayer, bowed his head, and a few minutes later he just looked up like it was just a time of day. But it was how compassion is shown, definitely shown.
Right. Now, I've heard stories, of course, about Mr. Keller and all that when he was speaking to, say, high school classes and could speak for, say, an hour and all this without looking at any notes. And some people kind of questioned whether he had all his facts straight. I've told people numerous times he had one of the best memories that I have ever seen.
Yeah, it was a strong memory. He could recite a date to me, and I would write it down and go home, go to the library and look it up, and sure enough, there it was.
Yeah, and I've heard some of his memory was sort of natural, obviously, and all this, but a lot that he had to do, try to help out with sort of being a pseudo lawyer for people with their retirement and such. Do you ever hear any stories regarding that?
No, he didn't tell me any stories other than the employees of the Western Ohio were just about down and out, and he did some research to find their employment papers and get them, I don't know whether it was retirement or unemployment. That was the only thing he ever mentioned.
How would you compare our museum and all this to a lot of the other ones you visited over the years?
Well, this is home for me. The museum has grown. I've watched 2 editions go on, and they haven't stopped. It is not the attic for the county government or the people. It's a place to retain the stories of events and people in different times.
Another name that was at least a part of the museum and all, not necessarily anywhere like Mr. Keller and all this. What dealings did you have over the years with Perry Percy, and could you describe what he did here as a job?
Well, Perry was originally an employee of Lima Locomotive Works. I think maybe it was a accounting department or something. He was in a set of buildings on the east side of the B&O tracks, as I remember. You know, I used to sell to Baldwin Lima Hamilton when it was owned by Clark Equipment. And so I would occasionally go down there and call on him. And he was at the end of the line, meaning he was ready to retire. Maybe he was retired. But the first I met him was here at the museum. I corresponded with him, and I needed a picture of a shay that my grandfather ran. And he came up with the print. And so my dealings with Perry were basically Lima locomotive. It wasn't anything city of Lima or Allen County oriented. And of course, in later years, there were some ill feelings between him and the museum.
Sure.
And of course, he was asked not to come back.
Right.
I was there and witnessed what happened. And I didn't lose respect for Perry, but I was disappointed in what had happened.
Sure. And another gentleman in all this that had an affiliation with the museum, among other spots and all, and I'm kind of curious to know more about and worked at the Loco Works, Bob Keller. What did you know about him?
Well, I met Bob with the 765, and we had originally done some work at Lincoln Park together, but beyond his work at Lima Locomotive and his local stories, I didn't know too much about him, but I always stopped and let him know I was in town because he lived out on Joe Jean Drive, and that was going home, so.
Okay. That sort of ties in then too in all this. You've seen some of the early origins of when they were working on restoring the 765, and at least you know some of that stuff and all this. Of course, that was a Lima product. Could you describe some of what the Fort Wayne group did?
Yeah, I was in on that at the beginning. After the 759 brought the Centennial train into Lima off the Nickel Plate Road, of course it struck several of us that we got to have one of them running here.
Right.
So there was me and Wayne York and Gary Bensman. We seen it, and we wanted to run another 700 series nickel plate Berkshire.
Right.
Well, we all had friends up in Fort Wayne, and they had a nickel plate Berkshire in the park. They weren't too pleased with where it was, but it is what it is. So we would meet in Dick Yeager's hobby shop, Sycamore Hollow Hobbies, at Fort Wayne on Friday evenings. He would close up, and we would just chew the fat about the idea of getting the 767, it had been renumbered, out and possibly restoring it. So we put together an idea, and we took it to the city of Fort Wayne, and they said, yeah, that sounds like a doable project. We didn't have any money, any sponsors. We used our own gas money. If we needed something extra, we passed the hat. And we went out there and got the 765 ready to move. We had to lay track across the street and join it into an existing siding. And then we had to move the engine slowly. And surprisingly, we did a good job because it moved.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
And we walked it all the way out to the switch at West Wayne on the main line. I remember sitting on the top of the tender, just sitting there soaking in the rays. In fact, it was a cloudy day, but it was comfortable. Okay. So out they come with the yard engine from East Wayne through the old West Wayne yards, and the engineer ran right straight through a switch and tore it up.
Ooh.
Well, John Eichmann was the wreckmaster of the NNW at Fort Wayne, and he was on part of our crew to move the engine. He gets his old notebook out and writes the notes down. So somebody had to fix the turnout before they could go through the yard again. But of course, we got it out the east wing, and it was an abandoned siding to the Casada military depot where we put it. And it had a derailment, and it was track tore out in that area. We had to put all the track back. We had to get all the materials because they didn't save anything for us. So John Eichmann says, well, there's a siding with ties in New Haven, and I'll take the rail off and you can take the ties. And so we did that. We took a load of ties from Hobart Brothers in Troy. They'd had a derailment and needed new ties. We only needed a track good enough to get the engine to hold.
Right.
So we did that and brought several weekends of work where we all went and did what we had to do. And we got it in there. And we had a boiler engineer, Sheldon Light. And of course, there was myself with the welding knowledge, and Gary had fairly good mechanical knowledge.
That's Gary Bensman.
Yeah, Gary Bensman. And Wayne York did an excellent job in his areas. And I can only remember him taking the washout plugs out of the boiler. But you know, I figured those things are in there for life. And by gosh, he'd stand there and he'd spray Kroil on those caps.
Right.
And it put the air gun on them, and a little bit they were going around. He got all of them out.
Excellent.
Because we had to wash the boiler out to start with. Well, then the winter time came, and we got a RPO, or not an RPO, but a refrigerator car from somebody up in Chicago. And we used that for our wintertime shop. And we took the air compressors off the 765 and tore them apart. It was relatively comfortable, and the overhead rails for the meat hook hangers became the hangers for our trolley, so we could raise it up off the floor. These things are heavy.
Oh yeah.
And move it into a position, and then Gary would get on the air gun and tear them down and put them back together. And of course, we had to find some parts, which came from 1225.
That's
and
the
some,
Paramark, correct?
yes, and some from the CNO, I think it was the 2781, which was the Berkshire on the scrap line down in Russell, Kentucky. Wayne went and got them. But I went down with Wayne when we looked them over, and they were still on the engine. His double-face pressure gauge was still on the engine. And of course, 765 had disappeared long ago. Eichmann, he had some wreck trucks, highway trucks, that if you cut them apart and put them back together, they probably, the two of them together, would make one good vehicle.
Okay.
So we decided to number it 767 and to finally put the original number back on 765. So people would come to New Haven, they're watching us on the weekends, and they'd say, hey, where's the 767 at? We'd point to the truck around the corner sitting beside the engine. There's a 767 right there.
How long did this project take overall, do you figure?
Oh, probably 5 years. I know I got married in 77 and we were going to have it running. No way.
Right.
That was, in fact, the idea was that we're going to have it running and take me and my wife on honeymoon.
Okay.
But it didn't work out that way. It didn't get the engine running. So we would sleep in the caboose on Friday night, so we'd be out at bright and early Saturday morning. Once in a while, if you had an extra $5, $10, You could get a room down at a local roadside hotel in New Haven. Wasn't very often. And let's see, we ate at Arby's roast beef quite a bit. But they had a darn good diner at the Nickel Plate Yard in New Haven.
Okay.
We learned early often that if we went in there, they would treat us like railroad employees and would only charge us a couple of dollars.
Okay.
And it was all you could eat. It was good. I still dream about it and try and duplicate it, but I haven't had much success.
Okay.
So when I finally got the engine completed, they called and they said, would you come up? We'll let you run it. Of course, with all the thousands of hours and gasoline that I had spent, that was just a treat to behold. So I got up in the engine, and Gary was the supervising engineer, I was the engineer, and John Keller was the fireman.
Okay.
So we ran down the east side, the west side track, around the curve to go into Casad, and then came back. I had a nickel plate caboose and that our refrigerator cars, the train. So it was quite a treat. And my fireman was none other than John Keller.
Oh, that's great. I love that part of it. Now, sort of another separate thing and all that. I know you were a part of and all this, starting our rail excursion program here at the museum and all. Could you give a little idea as to your input and all? I think you were a central focus on that.
Oh yeah. Well, let's see how we got into that was Pat Smith.
That was our former director, right?
Was having some serious concerns about finances. And I told her, I says, Pat, a sure winner would be to run an excursion from Lima down to maybe a High Bridge at Quincy and back, and charge them a moderate price. And I gave her some financial numbers. And she says, we'll have a board meeting. Well, the board didn't approve it. And so these concerns continued to be expressed, and I said, I give you the way to do it, but you won't do it. This went on for 5 years. And I figured there's somebody that in the board who doesn't understand it yet. And I found out who it was, but it was after we managed to run one excursion.
Okay.
And they laughed all the way to the bank.
Ah, yes, it's been very profitable.
Yeah, it was very profitable, and you had businesses that were willing to sponsor something, and the sale of the tickets, and the course in Cincinnati, they had the train they would bring up here, and it was just an overwhelming success. And I got on and narrated the trips because I had all the knowledge of the DT&I. And so year after year, excepting for our COVID year, we've run the trips and the coffers have been refilled.
Plan on doing it again this year, actually.
Yeah,
So, which we mentioned.
Find out later.
Right. I was just thinking in all this, I know you were around for some of the gatherings out at Lincoln Park, the open houses and all this. What do you remember or memories of, say, John Tomafee and all which he was, of course, a nickel plater and such?
Well, the first time I met John was out at Lincoln Park. John Keller would gather a group of us to occupy either some of the cars or the buildings, the locomotive. And John Tom Havey always got the engineer seat, and I got the business car seat.
Right.
And we would come back here to the museum after we had been open on, so let's say, a Saturday or a Sunday, and we'd have a potluck dinner.
Right.
And so people would, from a group would gather, and his mother was still alive at that time.
Right.
And she was a traffic manager for White Mountain over at New Bremen,
Right.
and she talked like a trucker talked.
Okay.
And I never said anything, but I was told by certain parties in the museum, you just got to excuse that.
Okay.
So uh, I heard from John about the Western Ohio coming through New Bremen, and all these times of running over to Tipton and to Frankfurt.
Could you explain again what Mr. Tomothy, what his job was
Uh, he was a fireman promoted to engineer.
for the nickel plate?
Yes, on the nickel plate. And between him and John Keller, there wasn't anything that they could not tell you about the run over and the run back.
Okay.
So I always enjoyed seeing John, and I went up to New Bremen just before he died and visited with him.
Right. What are your memories of, I'm sure those gatherings too, Phyllis Leach, she was of course an essential part of the museum way back when. What do you have any memories regarding her?
Not really.
Okay. Yeah, like I say, there was quite a few gatherings out there. I know quite often they put her in, and she was a good friend of Mr. Keller's then too, and all this.
Yeah. Was that Phyllis, the last girlfriend that he had?
No, that was a lady named Marcia Waldemuth.
No, that wasn't the one. This one had a granddaughter in Montana.
That was Phyllis.
That was Phyllis. Okay, well, I do remember a little bit of her.
Okay.
John called me one day and he says, could I impose on you to go to the Dayton airport and pick up Mrs. Leach?
Right.
And I said, oh, no problem. I'll just drive down here. It's a 20-minute drive from my house and bring her back. And we went over here, Happy Days, is that what's on?
We do have a Happy Days. Of course, way back on, we had the Cupies.
No, it wasn't Cupid's, it was.
We had the Huddle across the street.
No, it was right over here, where the bakery was. It was across the street from the bakery, and I think it was a Happy Days.
Could have been.
Because John says, I want to buy you all dinner. Well, we got tenderloin sandwiches.
Okay.
And she talked about her daughter being, what is it, first seat in,
A granddaughter.
oh yeah, granddaughter being first seat in some college orchestra or something.
Right.
And she was so proud of her. And that was just a nice acquaintance, you know, was somebody that occupied John's time, companionship-wise. And I always got along good with her.
Now, is there any advice you would give to anybody that wanted to do a would-be railroad author?
No.
Okay.
Just put
Common sense.
Just put pen to paper.
So it's not so much in all this for profit, it's more for the love of research and such?
Yeah. Well, you know your subject.
Right.
And if you don't know your subject, take the time to go out and discover. Don't be like these newscasters. Yeah, they're shatterers. They just go out and they pretend to know what happened, and they've not done their homework, and you get all kinds of excuses called news.
Right.
And excuses is all it is. You want people to know what you know and all that you know.
Right.
And so that's where I leave that topic. I've got 6 more books in the works. Of
Excellent.
course, the Lima book.
Right.
You know, Lima Memorial Hospital was originally founded by the railroad surgeons as a railroad hospital.
Okay.
And then I'm doing a book on Bellefontaine called Bellefontaine, the railroad town. Really fascinating how this town just suddenly goes from nothing up to a major railroad terminal.
Okay.
And I got a couple of other railroad books, Lima locomotive related, and my famous stroke book.
Okay.
which is probably gonna get a stroke of the pen one of these days.
Okay. Are there any other memories of this museum or anything that you'd like to talk about or that I didn't either bring up or that just come to mind? Let's talk again about, you mentioned the earliest of when you started coming here, the first to know this, the director at the time, and can you talk a little bit about some of the folks that you dealt with over the years?
Joe Dunlap was the curator when I came here. He was a very proud individual for what had been accomplished. And I remember John Keller saying that it was between John H. White of the Smithsonian Institute, who was from Cincinnati, and Joe Dunlap as to who would be selected to be the first curator.
Right.
You know, I met John H. White in 2015. I was to his office in 1970 in Washington.
Right.
And I mentioned John Keller, and he knew him.
Okay.
So this shows you how prominent John Keller was.
Right.
And of course, Ray Shuck come along, and I'm going to classify him a good old boy.
We kind of classified him as sort of an old hippie.
An old hippie would be a good way to describe him, but it was no nonsense. And I would always meet him in his office, which was the workshop in the back of the museum.
Right.
He'd be smoking a pipe.
Did he have his licorice with him too at the time?
I never seen any licorice, but he'd be smoking the pipe. And then, of course, when he retired, Pat came along, and the steps from the office back where Brittany is now, or beside Brittany on the other side of the wall.
Right.
I walk up the top of the steps to see John Keller. I needed something, and Pat Smith is sitting there, and she's the new curator, and that's where I met her. And she was an excellent curator for a number of years, accomplished a good many tasks that there'd be a lot of people fall far short of what she did.
Excellent. Now, did you ever meet Mr. McDonald?
Oh yeah.
Could you describe him a little bit? I really never met the man, so.
Well, he drove a nice car, I can tell you that. When they put the first edition onto the museum, must have been 76?
Something like that.
At any rate, I had come to Lima on a Sunday for something. It wasn't museum oriented, but at any rate, I decided to stop and see how construction was going. And they had the basement dug. And I was sitting on a pile of dirt, and here come this big station wagon, all this fanciness. And out pops this guy, and he just talked like he knew me. Well, at that time I was a nobody around here, so I talked to him quite often. And after that, we got used to John Keller seeing him or being maybe with me, or John would be with him. And so he was very intelligent. I would say he had his heart where a lot of people ought to have their heart.
And his wallet.
And his wallet. He was a very accommodating individual, and he was always interested. If there's anything, he was like John Keller. If there's anything I can do to help out, just call. And it worked for him.
Right.
So I think that having a bust of his upstairs is just very appropriate.
Now, do you remember any of the other ones when you first came here, all that were on staff or that you might have dealt with at any time?
No.
Okay.
I don't even remember when Anna came here, but I know she came from the library over.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether
40 or so years ago, I think it was, somewhere there in the neck of the woods. Because I know she's been here for quite a while. Are there any other just kind of random thoughts now you might have on the museum and its evolution?
well, it's like Ray Chuck said, they're a national treasure. And too many people live local don't understand that. This isn't an ordinary run-of-the-mill museum. I've been in museums that were in old firehouses. I've been in a museum that was a ruined library. I've been in the state museum many times, but this one has got them all beat.
Appreciate that. Any other thoughts you'd like to share with us and all this, whether, of course, your career, your association with the museum, or anything else that comes to mind?
You know, I've only been a member of this museum 2 times.
Okay.
John Keller paid for my membership card 2 times.
Once for me.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, I'm not a member of the museum either and all this. I figure I got a key. I can get in the building anytime I want.
There you go. But anytime he called on me, I'd come up and do what I could and appreciated the phone call. And you know, after John had pretty much taken to home life, he would call me about every 4 or 6 weeks and just kind of catch up on everything. Okay. And so I know what he had in mind for the future. Well, so far so good. And I kind of agree with most of what's going on.
Right.
And I think hopefully a lot of that is to our backs at this point.
So, how would you describe, say, our accessibility now for people doing research?
Not good. But that said, I've been in archives when they handed you the key and you walked into the archive and people were cutting things out. Oh, that's my aunt's picture. I got to cut that out and take it home. Or so-and-so's Civil War uniform. That belonged to my great-grandfather. Right. So that's mine. I'm going to take it. Right. There was no control. So I understand why the controls have to occur.
Sure. Yeah, I like to think at times in all this we try to provide the best we can under the restrictions we have and all this, and I understand that too.
Yeah.
Like I said, there's anything else again you can think of, or do you think we've covered most of the important topics?
Well, we covered most of the topics. You know, all the Lima locomotive builders photos. I didn't know you had them back there.
Okay.
And I've been coming up here for how many years for research?
Many, many years.
That's right.
Okay.
You know, and John has stuff crammed into dark corners of the museum.
Oh, yeah.
Every time I come up, I find things I hadn't ever seen.
New treasures, or old treasures becoming new.
The paperwork for the blueprints. You know, I was up here just after he got the call to come and get the files of Lima Locomotive Works, or they were going in the trash. I was in the car on a Saturday night, and he says, let's go out to the Quonsets. I got something I want to show you, which was a trolley car.
Right.
We get out to the Quonsets, and there's, I don't know, 2 or 3 semi-trailers sitting there. And he says, this is the records of Lima Locomotive Works.
Okay.
And I said, well, what's going to happen to them? And of course he says, well, some of them are going to be microfilmed by the Smithsonian Institute, and the people from the California Railroad Museum want access to some of them. I don't remember where all some of it was going.
Yeah, like the Gallier eventually and all some stuff there.
Yeah, the Gallier got some of it. Some guy from St. Louis came out. That was Shea stuff, and that was
Mr. Mangles.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was that Truce and Bugle and all that, I believe, out in California down here, and all this had part of it. Did you ever meet George Kadelic, that kind of mix and
No, just corresponded with him.
He was one of the ones in all this, obviously, we got. He kind of cataloged our drawings for Rod and Shea and all, and a heck of a collection.
Yeah, so it ends up being a very colorful story.
Very good. Well, I want to thank you very much, Scott, and all this for all the information you've been able to share with us.